found that really, really cool. And all of the people that I met during those trips like really inspired me. And I was like, wow, for the first time, like I'm dancing on a dance floor to like, you know, Indonesian gamelan sounds, which remind me of my childhood. But also have like such a mystical, you know, sort of transcendental aura around them that reminds me of like the psychedelic music that I'm really into right now. And, you know, I'm looking around the dance floor and it's like full of people who look like me. And I've never had that experience before. I always thought I had to run away to find it, but now I'm finding it literally on my homeland. And yeah, it was a beautiful feeling.
Hey everybody, welcome to For the Record, a casual, mostly unedited conversation series presented by Grey Matter, where we talk to music heads about their stories and the music that makes them. I'm your host, McKeegan Voice. Today on episode 32, we spoke with Michelle Lhooq. Born in Singapore, Michelle has dedicated her journalistic career to nightlife culture. She was my editor when I was writing for Vice's electronic music vertical, Thump, and she's gone on to write for The Guardian, New York Magazine, and the Los Angeles Times. Today she places most of her focus on her gonzo newsletter, Rave New World. And not surprisingly, she delivered a ton of gold by way of music recommendations. Hope you enjoy. Hey Michelle, it's great to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been a long time, as we were just saying. The origin of my relationship with Michelle was that she was my editor about 10 years ago. I was writing for Thump, the electronic music vertical for
the website who shall not be named.
Yeah. The website who shall not be named. Yeah. Anyhow, that's how we first connected, and it's been a long time, almost since then, since we reconnected. So I'm really excited to be chatting with you. And yeah, you know, as with all of these, I like to start at the beginning and just get a sense of you and where you're from and when your relationship with music started.
For sure. So I'm from Singapore, actually, and I was born there, raised there for much of my childhood before I moved to Tokyo, and then to upstate New York for a few years. But then I returned to Singapore and Tokyo for my teenage years. So I've had a very sort of nomadic childhood, but I would say that Singapore was really influential in some ways. Both Singapore and Tokyo were really influential in my early experiences with music. And I mean, if you really want to go all the way back, like it's kind of boring, but like every Asian child, obviously, like I played the piano. But it's funny because I just thought about this yesterday. Like I stopped playing the piano when I was like a early teen, like maybe 13 or something. And I distinctly remember the reason why. It's because I was starting to go through puberty and I started to think about emotions is really embarrassing. And it was like, wow, like emoting on the piano with your eyes closed and you're like putting all your emotions like into the public, like it's so fucking embarrassing. And so I had to stop. And like, I guess it makes sense for like where I was at that time. But then I kind of think back and I feel a little bit sad for myself to like be so ashamed of my feelings, you know, and also because I have beautiful piano fingers. Who knows where I could have gone. But I think that's relevant to like later in the conversation because I think that one of the reasons why I got back into music and electronic music specifically at like a later teenager age through raving and ecstasy is because it was like a primary channel into the emotions and into like states of being that I perhaps had been like taught to repress as like someone who came from, you know, a pretty conservative Asian background as a woman. Like you're just not really encouraged so much to like be very expressive around feelings. So I took my first ecstasy pill in Singapore in 12th grade. I hope nobody from the Singapore government ever watches this
Risky.
interview. But yeah, and that was like a really mind expanding experience for me, because obviously doing it in such a prohibitionist state was so scary, and paranoia and fear and guilt and all of these feelings were like a huge part of my like first experiences with like the liberatory qualities also of music. So it came hand in hand. And at the time, like I was partying with people who were pretty edgy, you know, like the only people who dared to do drugs like that in Singapore were like people who were like in juvenile prison or like military punk kids who were like in my expat like international school. And we were listening to a lot of hardstyle. We were listening to like DJs like Showtek, who are very like intense and kind of cheesy, but also like have this like really sweet melodic and like very teenager style rebellion. Like I think of that song "Fuck the System" by Showtek that goes like, you know, I just don't want to live for this shit, man. Like it just like has like really funny lyrics, but like also really potent lyrics about like counterculture. I think that really resonated with me at the time. And then I moved to Tokyo, and I was like listening to a lot of like Broken Social Scene and Metric, like a lot of Canadian bands, and watching them in Tokyo, like sneaking out of my house to go and watch them play at some random island like off of Tokyo. I mean, those were some of my earliest concert memories, and that was a really special time for me too. And I think that was sort of like everyone, I was kind of transitioning from rock to electronic in the 2000s. And that led me to like the Bloghouse era in New York. When I moved to New York City for college, I moved there peak Bloghouse. So, you know, I was going to a lot of like Ed Banger Records parties, and Afi was like one of my earliest heroes. And I think it's so cool that she's back now as a mom and like touring with Dorian Electra and making incredible music out of like the shadows of all of these like kind of sleazebag dudes, you know, that she was always kind of hiding behind back in the day. I noticed in one of your in the mapping that you've done with all of your previous guests that Burial's Untrue was a really big album for a lot of people, and I have to say, like, put me in that umbrella, you know.
It's a good umbrella to be under, I think.
I think that was one of that and like this is so embarrassing, but like Dead Mouse also just like kind of really like emotional. Like I keep going back to this word. A lot of kind of moody, emotional, dubby, trancy music, I think was like really important to me at that time. And then from my whole like Crookers, Boys Noise, Bower moment, I would say I was
a long time.
Yeah. So into Crookers back in the day. Oh my god. That was like me like sneaking into the basement of Webster Hall. Webster Hall in New York was like one of the only places you could get into under 21 because they had a basement party and for some reason never checked IDs. I think that one was maybe 19 plus. And so you could like sneak into the basement and then go up like into the other floors and see all the other acts. And I don't know, that was like my under 21 in New York hack at the time. And then I'm not afraid to admit it, like I was really into early EDM. And I think that's what helped bridge the Thump years, because in the beginning of Thump, we were covering a lot of EDM. I think that the head honcho's advice came from like a punk background and had no idea what was going on with electronic music. And they were just like, oh, EDM, like that's the new hot thing that the children are into. Like, let's cover that. And like, they really didn't know that EDM was like the opposite of what Vice wanted to cover or
Mhm.
should have been covering. Like it's the hair metal of electronic music. It's so dramatic and like
That's great.
ostentatious. Um, but like I actually started listening to a lot of trance music as a kid, like when I was in Singapore. So I
Mhm.
had this like really, I would say, like adolescent attachment to DJs like Cascade and Armin van Buuren
Mhm.
and acts like that were like, you know, becoming like, you know, globe trotting like celebrity DJ whatever that we were covering at Thump. So I thought it was like an interesting challenge in a way to like figure out how to cover Avicii, for example, and like a more like not investigative, but like just putting him in a cultural context and talking about the business and economic aspects of EDM, which is honestly kind of dirty sometimes, and how he was fitting into like the paradigms of electronic music at the moment in a way that was like more than, for like no shade, but like what a lot of like EDM blogs were doing, which were just like adulatory coverage, you know. So we were doing a lot of EDM at the time. I was going to like crazy festivals all over the world. But at the same time, like really discovering the 2010s like New York music scene, the, you know, the Brooklyn underground, which was really, really popping off at the time. And I would say that was like the beginning of like where today's electronic dance music culture in New York really sprang from, was like that era,
Mhm.
2010s, before like all the, you know, all of the all of the mainstream magazines and the big brands. I mean, we had Red Bull, so I'm not going to say there weren't any brands, but before all the like kind of basic fashion girlies kind of found out that techno was cool, you know,
Right.
and it was a little bit more of a space for like people who really couldn't fit in and found themselves kind of on the sidelines of a lot of other scenes and cultures at the time. And it was a gathering place for real sort of like avant-garde exchange, which I really, really enjoyed. And so it was cool because I think a lot of the DJs and producers that I was partying with at the time, you know, kids that you would just see around all the time, like Tyga Paw,
Mhm.
Earth Eater, you know, in the gay scene, we had like Physical Therapy and Michael Magnan and the Carrie
Mhm.
Nation. Like these were just the girls. These were just people who were hanging out. And then, you know, the whole Disc Woman roster, like all of these people just
Mhm.
like blew up and they became globe-trotting superstars. But back then it just felt like, I don't know, like I threw a party once where like I put like every single DJ that I knew back to back, every genre, every hour a different genre for like 12 hours in the back of like a fried chicken restaurant.
I
And
was
it was,
at that.
oh my God, you were?
Yeah.
Vincelandia?
I was. I was. I mean, unless you did more than one of them, I was in the back of one of them that you threw.
Yeah, I mean, that's the only one that I did at the fried
Okay.
chicken spot, and it was
Yeah,
iconic
yes, I was
because,
there.
yeah, I mean, I look at that lineup now and I'm like, oh my God, like this is a timestamp of the time. And there's no way that I could get some of these DJs to play, even if they were the only DJ for the night instead of one out of like 24, you know?
Mhm.
So I think it was a really special time. Like I helped to launch the Lot Radio and we were pulling in like a lot of DJs from the scene at the time who, you know, like they weren't quite at the international touring level yet, but they were local legends. And I felt like New York really needed a space like the Lot because we didn't have a Rinse. We didn't have, you know, all these other global radio stations around the world that have been like really instrumental in pushing forward like local sounds. So, you know, at the time I was like lucky through my job to be really connected to a lot of the other scenes that were happening, you know. Like I was really into all the collectives that were coming up at the time, like Nafi and Non were the biggest ones.
Mhm.
And like, you know, they would come through. And one of the things that I love about dance music, especially, is just how global it is, right? That like, you know, that it's a culture that is universalized, but at the same time, every region and city has its own specific socio-cultural conditions that it speaks to. So yeah, like I think that I was really vibing with a lot of stuff that was happening in Berlin, in the UK, in New York, and then later, I would say I started expanding. Like now that I live in California, I'm super into like a lot of the West Coast scenes, and like psychedelics especially, I think like have really influenced a lot of my like musical findings recently, as well as like leaving the sort of like big cities of New York, Berlin, London, and searching into like, you know, states like Texas have been like really cool to explore for me. I'm about to go to Texas for the eclipse next week, where Carlos
That's true.
Souffrant is like throwing an insane 3-day rave in like a random town called Denton with like 30 of his favorite artists, and it's so underground and it's only local. I asked him to do an interview. He was like, I'm only doing local press. And I was like, fuck
Wow.
yeah, you know, like this is what it's about.
That is pretty cool.
So yeah, like the last few months I've spent like traveling around Asia and exploring a lot of that scene, which has been really, really fulfilling for me. It's like connecting parts of my brain that I didn't know could
Mm.
be connected.
Mm.
And yeah, just kind of getting out of the, I would say, the nightlife matrix, which unfortunately I think has gotten a bit stale. But I'm still searching for the feelings. So yeah, I'm finding it a lot in like cities and places beyond the establishment, I would say.
Cool. Cool. Thank you for that. That was amazing. I I'm curious. I would love to hear more about some of the connections that were made while you were traveling through Asia, the kind of unexpected ones, you know, for you. And then I also want to just like, you know, if it's connected or related at all, just bring it back. You know, what you said initially about this, you know, early childhood experience playing the piano, and that being, you know, kind of an emotional outlet that you turned away from because it was an emotional outlet. I'm curious if you still, you know, you said that that would be important to, you know, the context of your own connection with music that came after. And I'm curious if you still think about that connection, or for that, you know, is part of these kind of connective threads that you're making as you continue to explore music.
Yeah, I think that like psychedelic use and drug use were what allowed me to open up the pores or the chakras or whatever you want to call it,
Mm.
and the blocks that maybe had been inhibiting my ability to like tap into feelings in the body. um I mean, I still wrestle with that. I don't think that I'm like fully complete with that journey.
Mm.
um but like I think that there always has been like a bifurcation in my mind of like east and west, and like my eastern side I connect with like my family, and um there's so much like beauty and power, I think, and like having a really strong family and social structure that happens in Asia. I find like in the West, people are really living in such individual silos and are so
Mm.
disconnected from like their parents and their siblings a lot of the time, and like their communities, you know, whereas in Singapore I have such a strong one. But I think that a big part of that also entails like playing a specific role, and a lot of like what I've done with my life really doesn't fit into like categories that people can understand in Asia, just because like
Mm.
drugs and raving is like so taboo. So
Mm.
um I think that it's really hard for people to understand how like I could be dabbling in those realms if I'm not like a criminal or like a gangster
Right.
or someone who's like just being really like risk, like a risky hedonist, which honestly I am too. I am those things. um but I think that I also have this like really strong tendency towards like thinking about healing and thinking about um alternative modes of living beyond like these really restrictive systems that we exist in. And that's
Mhm.
kind of the real driver of my work, and like how to create third spaces, you know, with my parties that I've begun throwing around psychedelic use. Um, and so, yeah, like I think that when I went back to Asia recently and really connected with the post-pandemic rave scenes that have been springing up there, which are so different from what I grew up with in Asia. Like nightlife in Asia when I was a teenager was like very Western centric. A lot of the clubs that we went to were like Ministry of Sound, you
Mhm.
know, like imports from the UK that like brought, and like they would bring in all of these like big DJs, and that would be the headliner. And I never had any like local friends who played, you know? But I
Mhm.
think pandemic really shifted things for a lot of countries in Asia because obviously they couldn't import DJs for a really long time. Like Singapore had a 2-year long like ban on nightlife, which is crazy.
That is
But
crazy.
that forced people to start going out of the clubs, first of all, and like doing really underground things in secret, and also booking their homies and booking locals. And I think that already there was a growing consciousness around like the desire to forge identities that were rooted in like the land and the region rather than like sort of this emulatory thing. And so yeah, I found a lot of really interesting post-colonial thought emerging within the rave spaces of like
Mm.
how do we create parties as well as music that speaks to our identities pre-colonization, and how do we put Singapore in dialogue with its neighbors like Malaysia and Indonesia and the Philippines that are all having really interesting musical scenes spring up, and how do we kind of bring in those DJs and create these regional networks that are really in dialogue with each other instead of trying to pull from Berlin, you know, these DJs who aren't any better, honestly.
Mhm.
It's just that they live in Berlin, so they have this clout.
Right.
And so yeah, like I found that really, really cool. And all of the people that I met during those trips like really inspired me. And I was like, wow, for the first time, like I'm dancing on a dance floor to like, you know, Indonesian gamelan sounds, which remind me of my childhood.
Mm.
Um, but also have like such a mystical, you know, sort of transcendental aura around them that reminds me of like the psychedelic music that I'm really into right now. And, you know, I'm looking around the dance floor and it's like full of people who look like me. And I've never had that experience before. I always thought I had to run away to find it, but now I'm finding it literally on my homeland. And
Right.
yeah, it was a beautiful feeling. Like I've never met trans people in Singapore until
Mm.
recently. I've never seen so many queer people in one space until recently. So, you know, all of these feelings, like I think that I have been appreciating in America through, you know, like the techno-feminism movements and the Black Lives Matter movements, all of which have been like really influential in reshaping dance music spaces in America, and
Mhm.
really influential in like expanding my mind as well. Like I remember like in the 2010s when disc women started putting female DJs front and center, like it was crazy at the time, even
Mm.
though now it seems so like, well, duh. But at the
Mhm.
time I was like, wow, there can be women up there playing
Mm.
like such hard techno. And I mean, obviously women like that existed for decades before too, but I think like the novelty came from actually being present and being there and seeing it in front of my face. And so I guess what I'm trying to connect back is like the feelings that I had in Singapore reminded me of the feelings that I had in New York in the 2010s when similar sort of like political changes were happening. But
Mm.
maybe it hit even deeper because it went back to like a lot of my childhood and these feelings of like guilt and like shame and like taboo and like I if I do this I'm a bad person. from like my early teenage years. And those feelings kind of started getting chipped away when I saw so many beautiful people just like me doing the same thing.
Wow. That's beautiful. Um, yeah, I'm curious if you want to, give any shouts to any of the artists that you saw or any of the collectives or communities that, you were part of while you were there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think this collective called Strange Weather has been doing a lot of cool things in Singapore by bringing in, like I said, a lot of regional artists and creating, I would say, like parties that are more than raves. Like they're almost like a post-rave concept that I think is kind of unique
Mm,
because, like I said, it's not based on the warehouse or like the Berghain model of a party. Like, they have like dancers coming in doing like choreography to like AI enhance like lighting landscapes, and
wow.
you know Indonesian artists playing like gamelan and like trance states mixed with like hardcore and gabber and like dembao, and it's just like it's so like hybrid in the sound that I really enjoy. There's another DJ that I saw when I was in Singapore named Daniel Hui. He throws a really cool queer party, and he was mixing like Vietnamese like Vina House, which is this like kind of cheesy, like really popular kind of like obscene, dirty lyric like
Mm,
form of electronic music that's really popular in Vietnam. And it became popular because like politicians started like releasing like TikTok videos of themselves like dancing to this music.
got it.
Um but like all of these like Vietnamese DJs started like putting it into their mixes and like doing really interesting things with it. And like yeah, this DJ Daniel was playing like Vina House mixed with like 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 Mando pop mixed with like deconstructed club and like baile funk and like techno, and he was just yeah, he was doing it in a way that like felt like I was like, oh, I'm listening to like an electronic music set in Asia. Like it's got this Asian flavor. And maybe it reminds me a little bit of like what was going on with Deconstructed Club in the 2010s, but now it's got all of these like musical references from Asia, from like really kind of discarded genres that were seen as super uncool, but like obviously through recontextualization can be made kind of interesting.
Hmm.
Um, I want to say like I didn't see him perform, but like Obese Dogma is this DJ who's doing some really cool stuff in the Philippines, and putting a lot of this genre called I'm sure if I'm going to say it right, but budot. It's like a Filipino genre that's again like kind of vulgar,
Mm,
um and like 140 bpm, and like it goes super
hmm.
hard. um there's another DJ from Manila called Versailles. She's like a dance music writer as well, and she's like a big champion of budo, and she's like trying to prop it up as like the next gom or like the next amapiano or something, but
Hmm.
like for the Philippines. In Singapore, I want to say like Endless Return is another collective that was founded by um, a classically trained producer as well as a buto dancer. So I think that they come from like places outside of like the traditional electronic music world, but they're creating a lot of really one of their artists is this producer called Van Gogh 666, who like created a whole album about the Singapore identity that's like really kind of funny and like fucked up, and uses a lot of like samples and slang from Singlish, which was the slang word language in Singapore. um and in Singapore, you can't do protests are illegal. You cannot protest the government in any
Huh.
way.
Didn't know that.
And so yeah, and so I feel like artists end up making subversive albums in ways that are like less direct than like political rap, for example, in America.
Right.
It's more about like often a sense of humor and like a slyness and like using samples to kind of at something like maybe like, you know, a clip from like a political speech made by one of like the big politicians in Singapore and then like remixing that. I don't know, just things like that. And there's like a slyness to the subversion there that I really enjoy in the music.
Yeah.
I want to say a shout out to a couple other artists that I've recently discovered through my travels. I would say like I went to Taiwan and had like an amazing time there. I think it's Asia's rave utopia because they have a lot of drugs, to be honest, and they also have very socially liberal attitudes towards like queerness and gender and things like that. But anyway, there were a couple clubs that I really enjoyed. One was called Pawn Shop, and there's a DJ there named Tsui, Tsui, who I actually found out about through the DJ Adam O, who throws really incredible parties here in LA. I think he's one of the like party producers slash DJs that I'm the most excited about here because his parties are very conceptual and very unique, and he's doing a lot of renegades that are free and open to the public and happening in like outdoor spaces. But he like had like a big spiral in Taiwan recently, and he wrote about it in his newsletter, and he specifically shouted out this DJ named Tsui, who he was like, this was the best set that I heard all year. So I kind of started listening to Tsui, and through Tsui kind of opened up this whole world of like Taiwanese house and techno. And I would say that a lot of the music in Asia is like very experimental, which I think is cool. Like it really speaks to like the chaos and the real struggle, I think, that comes with like being an outsider or like a more maybe, I don't know, there's just such a strong energy burbling up from the underground, and it's really cool that people are so into all kinds of radical expression. I'm just gonna stop there, but I could keep going. There's one more act because I know you want to hear you want me to shout out like cool, interesting people.
Yeah, totally. Please do.
There's one more act that I really fucked with when I was in Asia. Raja Kirik. Have you heard of them?
No.
RAJAKIRIK. And they're a duo from Java in Indonesia. And they're playing a lot of like gamelan mixed with like hardcore and techno sounds. And they specifically are super inspired by like folk trance dances, which I remember watching when I was a kid visiting Indonesia because my mom's from Indonesia. You know, these dancers go into like hypnotic states and they start acting like horses, jumping over coals and like doing all kinds of really supernatural shit. Cool. And so Raja Kirik, like during their performances, they often invite like a shaman dancer onto the stage who performs this like specific kind of Javanese dance that's like an anti-colonial dance. Like it came about like during the Dutch occupation of Indonesia, and like a lot of it like portrays the struggles of revolutionaries in Indonesia trying to fight off their colonial masters. In real life, they were unsuccessful, but in the dances, they're like these fantasies of like winning over your oppressors. And so, yeah, like sometimes in the show that I watched, like of Raja Kirik, they even played a documentary, like telling the audience, like, this is what this dance is about. And they brought the dancer on and then they performed. And so, yeah, like, you know, it kind of speaks to this whole post-colonial awareness and like consciousness that I think is rising out of the region right now in a really emblematic way. You know, like, this is what it's about. And it felt super powerful to watch that in a crowd of like other young Southeast Asians who mostly had never heard of this dance either, because it's so, you know, our own histories are so occluded from us. But hearing it being presented in this like format and then having sort of a rave happen around it, it was one of the coolest things that I did during this last trip.
Cool. I love that. This kind of experimental approach to like re-localizing, you know, these communities around the music and like the shared history that people have in these spaces is really cool.
Yeah. Sorry, do you mind if I close the window so that it's not so noisy for a
Oh,
sec? Okay. Yeah, the thing about living in LA is that someone's always got a leaf blower going on at all times. It's out of control.
It's a prerequisite to live in LA. You have to have a leaf blower on. Yeah, speaking of LA, I'm curious, like, you know, after this trip, and considering you know, coming back to throwing your parties, to Rave New World, and thinking about, you know, this project, which I love, you know, if you could spend a minute or two talking about, if you're going to adapt your own projects, you know, based on these kind of connections that you made through these recent travels and seeing these communities.
Yeah, definitely. I think that one idea that's really stuck with me is the notion of like grief within the rave. I felt during this last trip that there was a lot of grief in the air. um I mean, personally, you know, I was going back to Singapore to spend time with my grandmother who was dying and eventually passed away. So already I was sort of in this headspace of like trying to connect to like ancestral
Mm-hmm.
narratives. But it was really interesting because I found myself at a lot of parties and art exhibitions that were similarly discussing forms of grief, not necessarily grandmothers, but like, you know, even gentrification as a form of grief, because
Mm-hmm.
Singapore is developing so quickly that there are all these spaces that just disappear all the time, and the landscape is constantly changing, and you're not supposed to think about what was there before because it's all in the name of progress. But I find that a lot of artists obviously were creating work around this idea of like spaces that have disappeared or are disappearing. I went to some raves in like malls that were about to be demolished. And like, funnily enough, malls have a lot of like emotional connection to Singaporeans because that's where you spend a lot of your time. And like, there are some really weird malls out there that are pretty special and are like community hubs for like specific ethnicities. Like, you know, this is the mall for like the Thai people, and there was this one mall that served a lot of the Thai community that was like the coolest, most underground mall I've ever been to. Um, and yeah, like, so I started thinking a lot about uh communal expressions of grief and how in many ways like the dance floor is also a part of that, like, you know, release for a lot of people and processing. And how do we kind of bring in like Asian rituals around death and grief into the rave space? And so I started thinking about maybe throwing a party around Hungry Ghost Month, which is a really special ritual in Singapore. It's like a specific day of the year where you go out and you like honor your ancestors, you visit their graves, you burn paper money, you know, make all of these offerings. And it's just a way of like connecting with your ancestors basically, and processing their departure from like this realm, but also their continued sort of like protection over you. And I think something like that would be really cool to create a party around, because I think a lot about like our dance music ancestors. Like I think of ancestry as not necessarily being something only about your family, you know, or your blood relatives, but I think a lot of people in the queer community feel, like myself included, like I feel my queer dance ancestors. Did you say dancestors? I love that.
Dance, I love it.
I feel them in the air sometimes when I have these really profound moments on the dance floor. Maybe like on, you know, a psychedelic or two. And I feel like I'm reaching through the ether and like connecting with this like lineage and this like really fabulous multiple generations of people that that I'm so grateful to even be connected to, you know? And so yeah, something like that started bubbling through my mind. And I think
Cool.
a lot of my mushroom raves actually have also been rooted in the concept of grief. Like I started throwing mushroom parties in the pandemic as like a way to process what was going on with that. And they were originally just like a super small gathering in like a forest. That was super witchy and like under the full moon, and we were just dancing to like release a lot of the like death energy that was in the air. And then as the party progressed, I feel like that's always been like an undertone in the party, because for me mushrooms always kind of bring me to the space of death, not in like necessarily a dark way, but in this way of like through the muck we kind of reach up.
Yeah.
um and yeah, I think the last party that I threw um, was happening right as the Gaza war was erupting. And so there was already this feeling of like, should we even be partying? Like, is this appropriate? Which I feel like this question comes up every time there's like a geopolitical, like whether it's the pandemic or a war. Like,
Right.
I feel like this question always becomes like really pertinent around then. And it's a really complex and sensitive one. And I found myself like wanting to directly address like these really overwhelming feelings of grief that people were having over the war at my party. But unfortunately, like I think like a lot of people that I was working with felt like it was too tricky of a territory to dive into in a psychedelic party where people are already in very vulnerable states, you know. And I think I think it was a good note for me to like also think about how a lot of people who come to my party might not necessarily be on the same political spectrum. And so, you know, you can't just open up this dialogue in the middle of the party that could be non-consensual for some people.
Right. Right.
Especially since many people are just coming to a party to like forget about the world, you know. But I think that kind of opened up this other idea of like, okay, maybe one day I'm going to do a party specifically focused on grief, so that if you come to this, you are prepared to go there. And it doesn't have to be a scary thing. I think it's the opposite. I think that when you're able to process grief in community, and through movement, it can be one of the most beautiful things. So that's what's germinating in my mind.
Totally. I love it. Dancestors. Here's to the dancestors.
Cheers.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. I love this idea of being very intentional about these spaces. That it can collectively be are often used as a place, you know, to escape and to have fun. But to root that escape in some kind of an emotional processing, you know, specifically attached to grief. I think is really interesting. I've had, you know, pretty similar moments, I think, when uh, you know, being on mushrooms and feeling like this, you know, connectedness as much to death, you know, as to life, and like not in a bad way. It's just like, you know, kind of a grounding sensation of these realities coexisting and having like a you know, I guess the window into it feels, you know, feels a little more transparent, I guess, in those moments. So yeah, I'm for it. I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what else is really interesting to kind of connect it to music is this idea of like what constitutes music for psychedelic partying and tripping in 2024.
Mm,
Like, I think that a lot of psychedelic or meditation or ambient, not ambient, but a lot of like meditation and tripping music has been kind of relegated to the new age.
mhm,
Um, and like, I don't have anything against like Tibetan sound bowls,
mm,
but I think that it's a really creative and fertile space for like artists in the electronic music underground to be playing in.
mm,
And so with my parties, I think like I really try and approach musicians that I think would have a fun time with this creative brief. Usually people who are engaging with like plant medicines in their own sort of private spaces or even through their music already. Um, and yeah, like I really like thinking about the role of the DJ or the producer in like guiding a trip, because I mean there's fascinating research out there about how music is like the most important conduit for therapeutic experiences within the psychedelic therapy setting,
mm,
more so than like the dosage of the drug
mhm,
or whether you even do a drug. I mean, some of the research is really mind blowing. But yeah, basically the takeaway is that music is really important. I mean, even if you go back to like indigenous psychedelic music, like the songs that ayahuasqueros sing, like these songs are like the medicine to them.
mm,
So I feel like a lot of DJs that have been doing and playing in like psychedelic rave settings for a long time have a lot of this knowledge in them of like how to take someone on a journey, because that's the most important thing when you read all of these musicology studies on like music for psychedelics, is that it's really important to have a sort of uh progression of emotions through time, and that, you know, it does really follow what you would say is like a DJ progression, a DJ set progression throughout the night. There's like a build up, there's a climax, and then there's a release. And yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I recently talked to a musician, East Forest. He's more from like the psychedelic world, the plant medicine world, and he plays a lot during mushroom ceremonies. And I said to him, I think there's a lot of responsibility that you're taking on
yeah,
playing at these ceremonies. Like, what do you do if you see somebody struggling, like, you know, clearly having a difficult time? Like, do you intensify the music so that they can like kind of work through it? Or do you start pulling back so that they feel some kind of comfort? I mean, that's like a huge decision to make, like
yeah,
on an individual level. And like here, his response, I think, really kind of speaks to what a lot of people often tell me, is that it's really intuitive and that there's no one answer. And that when you're kind of dropping into these spaces, you're working in the realm of like post rationality and you're kind of
mm,
going into the vibe zone. And
mhm,
so it really kind of just depends on like what you are picking up from what this person is putting down in the moment, which
yeah,
again really reminds me of like a DJ set. You know, every
yeah,
room is different. But yeah, like I want to say like some artists that I've been really fucking with who I think are doing really interesting work in the realm of like psychedelic music and music to trip to. Um I think Brian Kasenik from The Bunker has been going on a really interesting psychedelic journey for the last few years. Like he created a sub label called Going In that has been releasing like long extended duration continuous mix releases. So, I mean, this is the perfect format for a trip because you don't have to get up and change to the next song or to the
mhm.
next mix. And it's such a little technical thing, but it really does like
Makes a
make a huge
difference.
difference. And,
Yeah,
you know, this is a relatively new digital technology, I think, that we have where we're able to cut like 4 hour long albums. And, you know, I think that it's a really cool space, like I said, for a lot of musicians to play in. It's like super long durational sets that are like oriented around the progression of a trip. So yeah, I think he's been doing some really cool stuff. There's an artist named Paige Emery that is releasing an album with Leaving Records next week. And her album is called Intercommunications. It's all about communicating with plants specifically. It came out of
Cool.
her practice of like singing and talking to her plants in her garden. And she has been in like plant medicine circles. She goes really deep into like the ceremonial work as well. So like, you know, communication with the spirits of like ayahuasca and other really strong teachers, but then also communicating with like flowers and how that's kind of a different modality than these, you know, ayahuasca plants that have like a very strong personality, whereas a plant, you know, I was talking to her about yeah, like how to talk to flowers. It was one of the most interesting conversations.
What did she say?
Yeah, she was also talking a lot about going beyond the nonverbal and the
Mm,
non-rational, and that a lot of it is from the heart and from the emotions.
right.
And each song in the album is like sort of a different way of relating to plants. So yeah, there's one called Washing, which is like one of my favorite songs on the album. It really sounds like you're being washed over gently by like tides of like her vocals. She does a lot of like vocal sampling and vocal effects, and she kind of like chops them up and like extends them into these really vibey, very like chanty sounds.
Mm,
Um and yeah, I'm trying to think of who else. Like, I think Caitlin Aurelia Smith released an album
yeah.
specifically about yoga and meditation, right?
Yeah, well, she's always done, kind of plant, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I think her first record was a plant based music as well. Um,
right.
I don't remember
Yeah.
the details at this point, but she's always, kind of been in that realm. Makes really interesting.
Yeah. And I remember she released one specific album that was like for yoga, I think because of her mom.
Mhm.
Her mom's like a big yogi or something. And
Cool.
I really love that. Yeah, and there's another producer, DJ from Detroit, Otto Dojo, who's been making a lot of really cool, very psychedelic and very introspective tripping music, I would say.
Cool.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. Thank you. Um, I mean, this is all great fodder, I think, for me personally, new music that I get to enjoy, and hopefully other people listening can as well. At this point, I would typically, transition into a few questions about, some of the music that you're listening to today. I think you've covered a lot of that already, which is amazing. So I just have two questions for you in this
Mhm.
in this realm. The first one is how you discover music these days, kind of rooted in who some notable curators or outlets, might be for you.
Yeah, so I have to say when I was working with you in the 2010s, I felt like an octopus with a tentacle in so many different realms, and I was getting so much information from music websites, music
Mhm.
blogs, like I mean I'm a little embarrassed, but like publicists were a huge one. I
Yeah.
was getting like reams and reams of promos in my
Yeah.
inbox. And I would just like dip in sometimes, like sticking a finger into the river and just plucking something out.
Yeah.
Um, and I really mourn like the loss of music media, of electronic
Mhm.
media, because I think we lived through the last gasp of a golden era for music journalism. Like when we were doing Thump, there was Fact, there was Accelerator, there was RA, there was The Wire. There were all these places, and like, smaller places too, like Dancing Astronaut, the EDM site, like so
Mhm.
many little blogs. And now they're all gone. I mean,
Yeah.
not to say that there's no more music media left, but like there's so few music newsletters now that I think are focusing on music recommendations and like new music. Tone Glow is a really good one. And I feel like as a result, my musical discovery process has gotten much more ad hoc and, to be honest, quite lazy. Like I depend on my SoundCloud a lot. My SoundCloud algorithm, I would say I just like swipe through and I see what my friends are reposting. So it helps that like I have a really well curated list of like people that I follow, I think, because I've just been using it for like 10 years. But still, like I feel like I'm in a bit of an echo chamber because I'm just following the things that like my friends are following, you know, and I don't do as much like digging outside.
Yeah.
But like, I mean, I think that newsletters and discords have taken the place of what used to be blogs and websites. And I'm a big fan of, I mean, you have a great Discord. Shout out to your Discord. I've recently joined like a music journalist Discord that came about when like Pitchfork shuttered. And that's been really amazing for venting, but also finding out about music. I'm trying to think, like, I look up a lot of artists on like rave lineups and like festival lineups these days.
Yeah, it's a good way to do it.
And then, yeah, I just listen to my friends a lot now. You know, I think that my musical taste has become much more localized. But at the same time, because I travel so much, like I'm tapping into, you know, scenes in other states and cities and countries that I think are really cool. So yeah, friends, newsletters, discords, and mostly just things that my friends like on SoundCloud.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good answer, and not as lazy as, you know, a lot of answers can be, because it has gotten, you know, so easy to just, you know, let the convenience of, you know, platform curation do the work for us. And at least your platform curation, what that you do rely on is you know, human based, and people that you know, and trust giving you the music. So cool.
Yeah, I mean, it really helps that I also started dating someone a few years ago who's an incredible like record crate digger. So we gotta shout out my partner DJ Ty because he's given me so much new music. I like mooch off him a lot.
Gotta date a music nerd. It's the way
exactly.
Cool. Okay, and last question for you, and this is the big one, the one that everybody hates. You're going to a desert island and you get to bring 3 records with you. What are they?
Yeah, I spent some time thinking about this one actually because I knew it was coming.
Well done.
And it was hard because I feel like typically when this question is asked, you want to say like 3 classics maybe. But like I started thinking about it and I was like, what is really the vibe that I want to be surrounded in if I was really marooned on an island? And I was like, I'd probably be losing my mind. Like, you know, I went to Burning Man. That was like the closest I've come to like being stranded in wilderness. Yeah, I went to like the Mudpocalypse year and it was like, oh my God,
yeah.
so hellish. People hate me for like shit talking the bad year of Burning Man, but I'm sorry. It was like living on a desert island, except the desert island was made out of mud and shit. And yeah, like I feel like I would just want to be surrounded by like really ethereal female vocals. Things that would make me like kind of dissociate and feel like comforted by the divine. So I think I would want Earth Eater's Irie album, which I have listened to in many K-holes. It's helped me through very dark times, as well as Juliana Barwick's Healing is a Miracle, which is one of my favorites and I think one of the most beautiful albums ever. And then my third one will probably be like for when I'm like having my little solo dance party on the island. Like, I think I would want to listen to something really kind of like psychedelic techno-y. Like, so I was thinking Orbital 2 would be
Sweet.
perfect.
Nice.
Just like vibe out and have my little desert rave.
Cool. That's a good trio. Good vibe. It's not a bad island to be stranded on. Amazing. This has been incredible. Thank you so much, Michelle. Really appreciate you and your energy and uh yeah, the work that you're doing, in these spaces and the intention you bring to them. For people who are listening, who want to get involved or read your stuff, come to a party, where's the best place for them to tune in?
Well, my Substack, I would say, is like my preferred funnel for finding out about me. Like, sure, you can follow me on Instagram, but we all know I'm just going to get lost in your algo and fuck Instagram anyway. So, I mean, I'm not saying Substack is much better, but at least, we get to have a direct conversation that's unmediated by an algorithm, which I like. So, yeah, my Substack is called Rave New World. And that's where I kind of write about my musings and observations and experiences and interviews with people from like the global rave and drug underground. I post about my parties there. I write about up and coming new drugs. I'm having a partnership with like a really interesting legal psychoactive next month, which I hope people will get into. Cool. Or even if they're not, just like find out about it. And yeah, my parties are called Shroom Rave. For now, I actually might be changing it up a little bit. In the next year or two, I'm interested in sort of experimenting with other plant medicines. But for now, you can find it on Instagram under Shroom Rave. And yeah, I want to shout out to you too, man, like for doing something really cool in the musical landscape in a time when it feels like there really just aren't that many cool communal platforms. I really love this idea that like you're not just interviewing people like in a podcast, but actually like taking all of the references that we're talking about and like mapping them into some kind of data set. Like that's really cool and like a really cool way to find out about new music. I have listened to a few records mentioned by some of your guests already, and yeah, it's so much better than the Spotify or SoundCloud algo. So shouts to you too.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's important. I think there's, music is truly a connective tissue, across people that that connects people and can bring people in the community, but oftentimes those connections are obfuscated by the platforms on which we consume music. So yeah, the hope is that we can turn this database into something interactive so people can explore these connections and music through the people who have connection to them already, and or it's like important enough to be mentioned in like an hour-long conversation, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, appreciate the shout. And last but not least, now that you've been through the ringer, who's another music head that comes to mind that we should have on the show?
I mean, my dream interview for you would be Carlos Souffrant. I think he would be an incredible interview. I'm a huge fan. Like I said, I'm going to his rave next week in Texas.
I'm
I
not
think
local,
like
so.
right.
Yeah.
I think that the artist that I mentioned earlier, Paige Emery, would be a really cool sort of person to connect with who can speak a lot about like plant music as well as like the LA scene. Gotta represent LA, I feel like there's a lot of really cool underground stuff happening in LA that people don't necessarily think about. And then maybe like Julian from aka Little Internet from New Models, who is a huge music head.
Right.
I think he would be really cool to like talk about, he's been in so many different scenes. He was the C-punk representative to like the mainstream media many, many years ago, and has dabbled in many other fields since then. So I think his view on music is really cool.
Amazing. Cool.
Yeah.
Noted them all. Cool. Well, Michelle, this was great. Really enjoyed this, and it's been so good to catch up and just hear about what you've been up to and the work that you've been doing.
Thank you so much. And good luck with your project too.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Absolutely.
Yep.
Take care. Be in touch.
Sounds good.
Thanks everyone for being here. That's a wrap on another episode of For the Record, a conversation series with all manner of music heads about their stories and the music that makes them. It's a production of Grey Matter and a new Crate Coalition experiment in building connective listening graphs. We stamp every music mention you heard here, from musicians to venue owners to journalists to tech builders to DJs, and in the background, we're mapping these names to form those yet unseen connective threads between people. Want to get involved? You can check out our website at greymatter.fm or come hang out in the Crate Coalition Discord. See you next time.